I have been saying since at least 2019 that the central government in India has a serious problem that needs to be tackled. It is, in effect, in a fiscal crisis that has been driven by its inability to increase revenues. This means that when confronted with the imperatives of fiscal consolidation or priorities that it wishes to secure, such as increasing public investment, it can only do so by cutting something else. This budget, in that context, has done a credible job of fiscal management. The government's desire, as expressed 3 years ago, was to increase capital spending. On the budget, capital spending has gone up quite considerably, with the result that out of every rupee we borrow, if the government meets its fiscal targets next year, then less than half will be used for consumption or revenue spending. And this is great, because the golden rule of fiscal policy states that one should not borrow to consume in perpetuity. Less than half of borrowing going to current spending and more than half therefore going to investment is happening for the first time since 2006. However, this does not mean that total capital investment has gone up. There is the government budget and there is public investment by central government public sector enterprises. Those added together next year will amount to 3.9% of GDP, which is exactly what it was in 2019-2020. So what's happened is that the public sector has been investing less and the government has had to make up for it on the capital expenditure side. The fiscal crisis has meant that to be able to reduce the fiscal deficit and to increase capital spending, revenue expenditure has to be cut. In fact, total expenditure has to be cut. For the third year in a row, the size of the government budget next year will be smaller than this year, and this year was smaller than last year. The state is shrinking because of the inability to mobilize revenues. Tax revenues are stuck at 11% of GDP. That's where they were 7 years ago, that's where they were 4 years ago, and that's where they are now. Regrettably, the performance on disinvestment, much touted by this finance minister when she came to office, has been a pathetic disaster. Year after year, disinvestment targets have not been achieved, not by 10 or 20%, but by 70, 80, 90%. This has resulted in huge revenue losses to government, and the government has then had to take emergency action to try and balance the books, which has increased the fragility of the fisc. Given this fragile and low quality of execution that seems to have become the hallmark of the finance ministry on the resource mobilization side, I think this government has done a terrible job in trying to protect its priorities. This has made trade-offs because there is no extra money. So money for capital expenditure means less money for something else. Less money for something else has been some good things, like less money being spent on fuel and fertilizer subsidies, but that money has not gone into other things like MGR, like the REGA, like the Employment Guarantee Program, for which there's a lot of demand, for example. Or let's say in putting more money into education or health or other such merit goods. The government could not possibly do that. All those savings had to be redeployed to capital expenditure or to reduce the fiscal deficit. And that is the tragedy of the long-term constraint that the country finds itself in. But for some reason, the policy ecosystem chooses to turn a blind eye to in their eagerness to cheerlead on the budget. It's a serious problem, collectively owned. We need to fix it. But until we do, I would say this was a good holding budget within those overall constraints.